because they didn't even realize they paid the wrong invoice to a threat actor sending a fake invoice. Their legitimate vendor says, well, you still owe me the money. Welcome to Business Technicalities, and we're going to talk about that phrase that destroys a lot of small businesses.
It won't happen to me.
They always say that until it happens to them. And it's unfortunate because we get calls from people having their worst day and they never thought it would happen to them. And boy, you've been involved in way more incidents than I have just because working with CompTIA and the different things. It's terrible. And one of the problems people have is the perception. They see it happen to the big companies. That makes the news when a multi-million-dollar company gets hit. You're probably not a big enough company to make the news. And when you think about how the news is made, it's made because there was such a large-scale service disruption, someone bothered to report it. No one reports when the small accounting firm down the street goes out of business. Maybe it makes some note in some chamber news event that such and such place closed after 30 years, but you don't always know why they closed. And we can tell you a lot of these places closed because of a cybersecurity incident. It's just a blip on the radar, and it happens every day.
Yeah, I mean, you're not necessarily too small to get attacked. You're too small for somebody to specifically target you and utilize resources like O-Days and things like that. Like no one's going to burn their O-Day to pop a 20-person accounting firm, right? Like, however, they will check to see if your door's locked. And if it's not locked, they will come in.
Yep. And we just, through a little bit of disclosure, we had discovered a company had a lot of their documents that services other companies publicly exposed, which undoubtedly we really don't know. And I don't know if the company's got good enough logging that this was used to then infiltrate some of the other businesses related. And once again, it's a crime of opportunity. Someone leaves a bucket open somewhere with a bunch of data in it, and you had given your passwords to some company to help with something, maybe a marketing company because you wanted them to update your website. And next thing you know, you end up on the list because it was an opportunistic find. And this happens constantly.
Yeah. I mean, it happens there. I think in this company, right? Same thing like a managed service providers, things like marketing companies are also a force multiplier, right? Because you get basically a B2B company that services a bunch of people in the technology space, right? So in the case that you were talking about the other day, you and I both did a little bit of poking on it. I haven't done any additional poking. We should probably reach out to them and see if they want us to do additional poking. Do some sort of paid engagement. But it is definitely the case that, you know, you can certainly create a lot of grief. You could encrypt somebody's website, depending on, you know, what they are doing. You know, maybe it's in your GoDaddy account and those GoDaddy credentials. If you're using the GoDaddy email, maybe they can get into your email. And then there's a whole list of downstream nonsense that we can get into from there.
And small businesses being hit by business email compromise, the FBI did a report on this, just showing the scale and scope that it happens at. And that's only what they know about. I know many companies, due to the fact that they were frauded, and there's not a way, because once you wire the money and you wired it, the bank goes, hey, you told us to wire the money to some email that came in.
2 days. I think maybe it's 72 hours. It's either 2 or 3 days. If you can catch it in those 2 days, then they have a 60% success rate in clawing the money back. Outside of the 2 days, it's essentially 0%. They just, there is no ability for you to get that money back.
Yeah. And that's what companies don't realize. We dealt with a client that had wired over, I think it was about $60,000 or $70,000. And because they didn't even realize they paid the wrong invoice to a threat actor sending a fake invoice that made it look like it was coming from one of their legitimate vendors, the vendor says, well, you still owe me the money. That doesn't change. And sorry that you paid money to somebody else, but that is a you problem, not a me problem. And like you said, there's not a clawback for this once the money's been wired, especially it was weeks before someone really noticed. It was when the vendor called and said, you still didn't pay my bill.
Yeah. I mean, there's a second set of words that I think also hurts small businesses. And that is, I have insurance for that. Because I believe that most companies think that they're protected by insurance, and maybe they are. We definitely, I would say it's getting better, but more than 50% of the companies that we do an initial walk-in on are not properly covered for cyber.
No.
They either don't have it, maybe it's a rider. There's carve-outs for things like business email compromise that have relatively low sub-limits, and there's all sorts of other things that go along with that. But even if you are properly insured, the insurance resolution and claim process is a long process.
Yes.
Right. So can you have, right, like it's recommended that you have 6-month cash in bank. If you pay out a $200,000 invoice, right, like does that drop you below 6-month cash in bank? Because it could take 6 months for you to get your money back from that insurance company.
Yeah. And the insurance companies aren't in the giving away money business. They are always looking for reasons to deny the claim. This is
Yep.
where we've worked with people to confirm that just because you knew you got a discount by checking some boxes, that you were doing the things in those boxes you checked. You can't just say, I'm using multi-factor authentication
Yeah.
or I've done these extra security steps and then not do them, because those are reasons to deny claims. We've talked about this with clients, and it's part of our initial meeting with them is like, hey, cool, you'd love to use us as an MSP. We'd love to make sure you have proper coverage. It is, we'll just point out what lines up and what doesn't, and then you can have a conversation with your insurance company. But it's all about making sure people really understand the risk.
Yep, it's a lot of this is again down to just discussions because I covered it in the video I did on LinkedIn yesterday when we we're recording this, but by the time we release it, it'll be several days ago.
Yeah.
The most companies have a very naive understanding of how involved technology is in their business, right? Like they think they can live without technology, but even if you don't do a formal tabletop, even if you have a very informal conversation, start with like, okay, how do you do payroll?
Right.
Okay, I do payroll in QuickBooks. Okay, well, you're not going to have access to QuickBooks. So, like, if this happens, if you have a server, and this applies to not just security, you know, we beat the security drum a lot, right? And the reason we beat the security drum a lot is because the other half of this, the availability piece of it, if you're dealing with a reputable MSP, is probably mostly solved, right? You have the BDR or BCDR plans in place, right? Like, you have backups, you can spin that back up. But how are you going to pay your employees if your QuickBooks is down for a week or
Right.
2 weeks or a month?
And those are the real challenges of making
Yeah.
sure you have that problem solved.
And it's even more complicated than that, because the answer to that is often, well, that's why I have you have good backups, right? Like, but yes, maybe, but what do I restore to when you have a full ransomware event and your insurance company wants their DFI, their data forensic incident response team, to figure out how the people got in and do all that other stuff, so they have your hardware tied up for 2 weeks, right? So it's like, now you can't restore the workstations because you can't use the hardware. The insurance company is doing forensics on it. You can't restore the server because the insurance company is doing forensics on it. I may not be able to fix that. You may have to make a choice between abandoning the insurance claim because they can't do forensics, so they're not going to pay you, and getting back up. Like, that's not a spot you want to live in.
No, and this is the reason we encourage, when we can, tabletop walk through these. And that's why we call it business continuity, not just backup. Backup is a piece of business continuity. This is always a bigger topic to have with your clients is, hey, if we unplug everything, what happens? How long can this, how long can you survive like this? And it's probably less time than you think. And this is where, coming all the way back to the assessment topic, this is why assessments are so important. So you can understand and identify all those things that are important and critical to the business, so plans can be put around how to mitigate this.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing that once you identify and can talk about those risks, no matter how likely they are, right? Because there's a matrix here of impact if it does happen and likelihood that it will happen. And maybe some of these security things are relatively low on the likelihood that would happen, but the impact if they do happen is very high.
Yeah. Once again, to wrap this up, you're not too big to be hit. You're probably too small to make the news. That is a definite thing. That is just a recurring thing. We want people to remember this happens way more often. As often as you think it happens to the big companies, it is operating at another scale at these smaller companies, and that scale's pretty damn big.
It's a scary world out there. We're not trying to FUD. We're not trying to scare you into doing it. We're trying to make you internally internalize and determine what those risks are, so that you can make proper decisions. That may be dealing with an MSP. It may be still doing it on your own. Maybe you accept the risk, but you should at least make that with all the data available to you.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. See ya.